Today, we're diving into one of the biggest, most hotly debated stories in all of ancient history, the Indo-Aryan Migration. For a really long time, the story we were all told was one of a violent invasion, a massive conquest. But what if the science, what if the actual evidence tells a completely different story?
This was the question, right? For more than 100 years, this idea shaped everything. It painted this really dramatic picture of these horse-riding warriors from the north just sweeping in and completely wiping one of the world's greatest early civilizations, the Indus Valley people, right off the map. But is that actually what happened? Let's take a look.
You see, for a long, long time, the main story was called the Aryan invasion theory. It was this very simple, very dramatic image of chariot warriors thundering down from the steppes and just laying waste to the sophisticated cities of the Indus. It's a powerful story for sure. The only problem is, it's pretty much wrong. So let's break this down. On one hand, you have the old invasion theory, which really came out of the colonial era. It imagined this fast, brutal conquest that just annihilated the local people. On the other hand, you have the modern migration theory. This one's backed by a ton of new evidence, and it paints a picture of a slow, centuries-long movement of people. It wasn't a replacement, it was a mixing of cultures. I mean, the difference is just night and day.
And here's a perfect example of how that old story got built. This archaeologist, Mortimer Wheeler, he looked at the Rigveda, the sacred text of the Indo-Aryans. He saw their main god, Indra, had a title, Purandara, which means fort destroyer. And he literally pointed to the ruins of the great Indus cities and said, "There's your crime scene." This narrative was also, pretty convenient for the British Empire, framing Indian history as just a series of conquests. And to really get this, we have to talk about language. A huge part of the old invasion theory was based on the word Arya, which they interpreted as a racial term. But when you actually go back and analyze the text, the Rigveda itself, it's totally different. Arya wasn't about biology. It was a cultural label. It meant something like noble or honorable, and it was used to distinguish people based on their language and their customs. This one detail alone really starts to pull apart that old invasion idea. Okay, so if it wasn't a huge, violent invasion, what was it? Well, the first big clue, the thing that changed everything, doesn't come from an ancient text or a dusty ruin. It comes from a source locked deep inside every one of us, our DNA. So in 2019, this absolutely massive study comes out. Scientists analyzed the genomes of over 500 ancient people from all across South and Central Asia. This was a complete game changer. For the first time, we had a genetic snapshot, a way to actually trace how ancient populations moved and mixed.
And here's the kicker. This is what they found. When they looked at the DNA of the people from the Indus Valley civilization, there was zero ancestry from the northern steppes. Zero. That genetic signature only shows up in South Asia after 2000 BCE, which is way after the Indus cities had already started to decline. And, this part is fascinating, it was overwhelmingly men who carried that DNA. This points so clearly to a migration of small groups, not a giant invading army bringing their whole population with them.
So, genetics gives us the who and the when. But what about the how? For that, we turn to archaeology. We can literally follow the breadcrumbs they left behind, their pots, their graves, their technology, and map their entire journey.
And this timeline just lays it all out. It didn't happen overnight. It was this long, drawn-out process. Around 2200 BCE, you've got the Sintashta culture up on the Eurasian steppes. These are the folks who invented the fast, spoked wheel chariot. Then they start moving south. They bump into farming societies in Central Asia. By 1600 BCE, we see their graves pop up in the Swat Valley in Pakistan. And finally, around 1500 BCE, they're in the Punjab region, what they called the Sapta Sindhu, and this is where they're composing the hymns of the Rigveda.
I mean, just look at this contrast. It's like two totally different worlds. The Indus Valley civilization, it was urban, built around trade, they used solid-wheeled carts, and the bull was a huge symbol for them. The early Vedic culture, they were pastoral, tribal, and their entire world revolved around two things you just don't find in the Indus Valley: the horse and that spoked-wheeled chariot. They were fundamentally different people. Now we get to one single date, a date that comes from hundreds and hundreds of miles away, but it acts like an anchor, locking this whole timeline into place. It's an incredible piece of evidence. Okay, get this. In 1380 BCE, way over in modern-day Turkey, two kings sign a peace treaty. And to make it official, they swear oaths to their gods. And who do the Mitanni kings call on as divine witnesses? Indra, Varuna, and Mitra, the exact same gods from the Rigveda.
We even have horse training manuals from the area that use Indo-Aryan numbers. It's just concrete, undeniable proof that Indo-Aryan speakers were already in West Asia by this time, which fits the migration timeline perfectly.
So, you see, when you pull all the threads together, the genetics, the archaeology, the linguistics, the puzzle starts to make sense. And that old, simple story of a violent invasion gets replaced by something much more complex, much more gradual, and, frankly, a lot more interesting. So let's just recap why we now say migration, not invasion. First, it was a slow trickle of people over centuries, not a sudden flood. Second, the great Indus cities were already shrinking, probably because the climate was changing, long before these new folks showed up. And third, what happened next wasn't a replacement, it was a blend. Local groups started adopting the language and the culture of the newcomers, creating something new. All right, we figured out how they arrived, but who were these early Indo-Aryans? What was their world actually like? Well, the Rigveda gives us this incredible window into their lives. So their world was tribal, it was mobile, they were led by a chief, a Rajan, but he wasn't some all-powerful king. He had councils he had to listen to. Their entire economy was about their herds, especially their cattle. And, for the ancient world, it was a pretty egalitarian society. Women had high status, some even composed hymns that are still in the Rigveda today. And what's really key is that their loyalty was to their tribe, the Jana, not to a specific plot of land. And if you want one word that perfectly captures their entire worldview, it's this one, Gavishti. It has two meanings. Literally, it means the search for cows. But it was also the most common word they used for war. The fact that going to war and looking for more cows were the exact same word, well, that tells you everything you need to know about what mattered most to them. So we've basically rewritten a huge chapter of ancient history. But let's be real, this stuff happened 3,500 years ago. Why does it still matter so much? Why is it still so debated today? Because this story is the perfect example of how history can be used as a weapon. The old invasion theory, remember, was used to justify colonial rule. And then, in reaction to that, some modern political groups tried to deny that any migration happened at all. By grounding the story in science, in genetics, in archaeology, we can get past all those biased agendas and just try to see what really happened. And really, the true story is so much more profound than any of the myths. It shows us that the civilization of South Asia didn't spring from one single, pure source. It's a rich tapestry woven together from so many different threads. From the original people of the Indus Valley, from these migrating pastoralists from the north, and from countless other groups. It's a story of movement, of mixing, and of creating something new together. And that kind of leaves us with one last thought, doesn't it? For decades, the story of the Aryan invasion was considered settled history. It was in all the textbooks. And then, new evidence came along and completely flipped it on its head. It just makes you wonder, what other known histories, what other things we think are facts, are just waiting for the right discovery to be totally rewritten?